Close your eyes for a moment. Picture New York City. The year is 1971. It is early January. The air outside JFK International Airport bites with a cold that only a New York winter can manufacture. A cold that cuts through whatever you are wearing, that gets inside your coat, your chest, your bones. Inside the terminal, the lights are fluorescent and buzzing. Travelers move in slow rivers through the corridors. Flight attendants click past on heeled shoes. Luggage carousels hum their mechanical indifference. And somewhere in that crowd, moving calm and unhurried to the terminal, is a man. He is dressed well. Too well for someone who has just survived a 16-hour flight from Southeast Asia. His shoes are shined. His posture is perfect. His eyes are alert, but his face is serene. The face of a man who has either never done anything wrong in his life, or who has done so much wrong that fear no longer registers the same way in his body. His name is Frank Lucas. And somewhere in the cargo hold of the plane that just landed behind him, inside a shipment of custom-built furniture, inside hollow spaces that have been carefully, brilliantly engineered, is more heroin than most federal agents had ever seen in one place. The product of poppy fields growing deep in the jungles of the Golden Triangle, processed in mountain caves near the borders of Thailand, Burma, and Laos. Heroin so pure it was almost blue. Heroin that would later be sold on the streets of Harlem under the brand name Blue Magic. Federal agents were watching, but they didn't move. Not yet. Not that day. Because Frank Lucas was a man who had learned patience from a master. And that master, the man who had ruled Harlem for more than 3 decades before Frank Lucas ever dreamed of touching the sky, had been dead for 3 years. His name was Bumpy Johnson. And to understand what Frank Lucas was doing at that airport, to understand the empire he was building and the ruin it would eventually become, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to Frank Lucas's beginning. Not even to Bumpy Johnson's beginning. You have to go back to before either of them existed. Back to when Harlem was not yet a kingdom. Back to when it was just a neighborhood. A beautiful, crowded, jazz-soaked, heartbreaking neighborhood. Where a community of black Americans had carved out something extraordinary from a country that had never wanted to give them anything at all. That is where the story truly begins. And it ends as all great empires end, not with a bang, but with a slow unraveling, with betrayal, with prison cells, with men who had been untouchable discovering, at last, exactly how mortal they were. This is the rise and fall of Harlem's underworld kings. Settle in. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while. Before we go any further into this story, drop in the comments right now. Where are you watching from and what time is it where you are? I read every single one. If you enjoy stories like this, real history, real people, real stakes, hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button. Share this with someone who loves history, who loves real stories, who has ever stayed up past 3 in the morning, because they simply had to know what happened next. Now, where were we? Right? Harlem, before the kings. To understand what Harlem became, you first have to understand what it was. And what it was at the turn of the 20th century was something that no city planner, no architect, no Manhattan real estate developer had ever intended it to be. Harlem, the neighborhood that occupies the northernmost stretch of Manhattan, from roughly 96th Street up to 155th, was originally designed as an upper-class white residential community. In the 1880s and 1890s, developers built elegant brownstones and apartment buildings in anticipation of subway expansion that they believed would make the area a fashionable address for wealthy New Yorkers. They invested heavily. They overbuilt. They got greedy, as developers always do. And then the expansion was delayed, the market turned, and Harlem was suddenly full of beautiful buildings with no one to fill them. The landlords, facing financial ruin, made a decision that would change the history of America. They opened their buildings to black tenants. What happened next was not just a demographic shift. It was a seismic event. Between approximately 1910 and 1930, hundreds of thousands of black Americans left the Deep South as part of what historians call the Great Migration. They were leaving the violence of Jim Crow, the lynchings, the sundown towns, the sharecropping system that was barely distinguishable from the slavery that had theoretically ended in 1865. They were heading north, toward industrial cities with a promise, however imperfect, however laced with its own forms of racism, was at least a different kind of hope. New York City drew them in enormous numbers. And within New York, Harlem became the destination. By 1920, Harlem held nearly 200,000 African Americans within its few square miles, making it the largest concentration of black people in the world. They came from Georgia and Mississippi, from South Carolina and Alabama, from the Caribbean islands of Martinique and Jamaica and Barbados and Guadeloupe. They brought with them their music, their food, their languages, their churches, their stories, their grief, and their determination. They built something that the world had never quite seen before. The Harlem Renaissance. The extraordinary explosion of black art, literature, music, and political thought that flowered through the 1920s was not an accident. It was a direct result of what happens when a compressed, talented, resilient community is given, for the first time in its collective experience, something approximating space and proximity to itself. Langston Hughes wrote his poems on the streets of Harlem. Duke Ellington played the Cotton Club. Billie Holiday sang from a place so deep inside herself that audiences didn't know whether to clap or cry. Zora Neale Hurston walked those avenues. Marcus Garvey preached black pride and self-determination to crowds of thousands. Thurgood Marshall lived in one of the neighborhood's most prestigious buildings as a young man. But here's the thing about beauty and poverty existing in the same place. The beauty is real. The poverty is also real. And where poverty exists alongside beauty, and where a community is systematically excluded from the legitimate economy of the city and country around it, something else will always grow to fill the gap. Harlem in the 1920s was not just a center of black cultural life. It was also a center of black economic ingenuity that operated entirely outside the law, not by choice, by necessity. The banks would not lend to black people. The good jobs went to white men. The unions kept black workers out. The investment opportunities, the stock markets, the bonds, all of it existed in a white world that had no intention of opening its doors. So Harlem built its own economy, and at the center of that economy was a game that everyone played. They called it the numbers. The numbers racket, also known as policy or the policy lottery, was an illegal gambling operation that functioned like a street-level lottery. A player would pick 3 digits, any combination from 000 to 999. They would place a bet with a runner, sometimes as small as a penny, sometimes much more, and if their number came up that day, they won. The winning number was publicly determined by a verifiable outside source, often the last 3 digits of the daily U.S. Treasury balance, or specific financial figures published in the newspapers, which made it essentially impossible to fix, which was part of its appeal. The payout odds were typically around 600 to 1, though the actual mathematical probability of winning was 1 in 1,000. The house, the banker, in the language of the game, kept the edge. Not unlike any legitimate gambling operation anywhere in the world, except that this one operated in the shadows, and its entire infrastructure was black-owned and black-operated at a time when black-owned and black-operated businesses of any kind were rare and precious. Harlem's numbers racket in its heyday involved hundreds of runners, dozens of controllers, and a network of bankers whose job was to finance the whole enterprise, paying out the winners, absorbing the losses, managing the employees. By the early 1930s, the total money flowing through Harlem's numbers economy was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and the most powerful banker in all of that vast, crackling, underground economy was a woman, a small, impeccably dressed, supremely dangerous woman from the Caribbean who had arrived in New York with nothing and built herself into a legend. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair, and she was the one who set the table that everyone else would eventually sit down to eat at. The early life of Stephanie St. Clair is, like the early lives of many extraordinary people, partially obscured by time and by her own deliberate myth-making. What seems certain is that she was born in the French Caribbean, most likely on the island of Guadeloupe or Martinique, sometime in the late 1880s or early 1890s. She arrived in New York City around 1911, speaking French, navigating an English-speaking city in which she was both black and foreign-born, which meant that 2 separate systems of discrimination were immediately arrayed against her. She responded to those systems the way she would respond to everything that opposed her for the rest of her life. She ignored them and did what she wanted anyway. By 1917, St. Clair had invested $10,000 of her own savings, money whose origin she never fully explained, which is probably the way she wanted it, into establishing a numbers bank in Harlem. Within a few years, she was running an operation that employed somewhere between 40 and 50 runners, 10 controllers, and several bodyguards. She was earning upward of $200,000 a year at a time, when the average American worker was making a few $100s per year. She lived in one of Harlem's finest buildings, the same building where W.E.B. Du Bois lived, where Thurgood Marshall would eventually live. She wore extravagant clothes, fur coats, and jewels. She was known throughout Harlem as Madam Queen. She ran advertisements in local newspapers calling out police corruption by name, publicly listing officers who had demanded bribes and the exact amounts they had demanded. This was an act of such audacity that even her rivals struggled to fully believe it. She was not merely tolerated by the community she operated in. She was genuinely respected, even loved, by many of the people whose bet she took and whose winnings she paid. She also used some of her considerable profits to fund community programs, to donate to civil rights causes, and to advocate publicly for the legal rights of black New Yorkers. She understood, in ways that will be recognized far more clearly by later generations, that the underground economy she ran was not separate from the community around it. It was part of it. The numbers game was, as one historian wrote, a people's game, a community pastime where the laundrywomen and the school teachers and the pool players all participated together, creating a web of economic interconnection that formal banking would never have permitted. But Harlem was about to become contested territory. In the early 1930s, as Prohibition drew towards inevitable end and the Jewish and Italian crime bosses in New York found their bootlegging profits drying up, they looked north and saw what Stephanie St. Clair had built. They saw the money flowing through the numbers banks. They saw the infrastructure, the employees, the reach, and they decided they wanted it. The most aggressive and dangerous of men who moved on Harlem's numbers game was a Bronx-based mob boss named Dutch Schultz. Born Arthur Flegenheimer, Dutch Schultz was a German-Jewish gangster of explosive temper and extraordinary violence who had made his fortune in bootleg beer and was now looking to replace that income. He moved into Harlem with the backing of crooked police officers and corrupt politicians, and he began demanding tribute from the numbers bankers. Pay him a portion of your take, or suffer the consequences. Most of the numbers operators paid. They had no real choice. The consequences Schultz threatened were not metaphors. He had men who hurt people, and behind those men stood a police department that looked the other way when those people were hurt. Stephanie St. Clair did not pay. Instead, she went to war, and the weapon she reached for was a young man who had recently come to her attention. A young man of slight build and enormous intelligence and a short temper that had never once in his life bent itself to the idea of submission. A young man whose name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Everyone in Harlem called him Bumpy. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson came into the world on October 31st, 1905, Halloween, a date so perfectly suited to the man he would become that it seems almost like a story someone made up. He wasn't. He was real, and he was born in Charleston, South Carolina, into a black family navigating the particular horrors of the American South in the early 20th century. His nickname came from a pronounced knot on the back of his head, a physical bump that was present from birth and that distinguished him immediately from every other child in the room. The bump would prove to be the least unusual thing about him. His early childhood in Charleston was marked almost immediately by the kind of racial violence that structured life in the Jim Crow South. When Bumpy was approximately 10 years old, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. The accusation alone, in South Carolina in 1915, was enough to warrant a lynching. The family understood this with the absolute clarity that black families in the South had developed over generations of living adjacent to white terror. They didn't wait to find out what would happen. They mortgaged their small home to raise enough money to send Willie north, where he could disappear into the anonymity of a northern city. As Bumpy grew older, his parents watched him with increasing anxiety. He had, from a very young age, an absolute unwillingness to show deference to white people. In the South, in 1915 or 1916 or 1917, this was not a personality quirk or a point of pride. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. His short temper, His refusal to bow his head, his tendency to meet a racist slight with his eyes wide open rather than cast down, these qualities were, in the South of that era, genuinely dangerous. In 1919, when Bumpy was 14 years old, his parents made the decision to send him north to live with his older sister, Mabel, in Harlem. It was not presented as an adventure or an opportunity. It was presented as the only option available to a black boy in South Carolina who refused to act afraid. Harlem in 1919 was electric. The Great Migration was at its height. The streets were full of people who had come from everywhere, who were building something new, who were loud and alive, and creating the cultural ferment that would become the Harlem Renaissance. Bumpy Johnson arrived in that city at 14, with a southern accent thick enough to cut with a knife, a small frame that made him look younger than his age, and a temper that had not been softened by the move north at all. He dropped out of high school quickly, not because he was unintelligent. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily intelligent, but because the organized march of formal education could not hold his attention the way the street could. He worked odd jobs. He shot craps. He ran with an increasingly serious crowd. He developed a reputation as a scrappy fighter who would not back down from anyone regardless of size, and this reputation eventually brought him to the attention of a small-time gangster named William Bub Hewlett, who began using the young man as a bodyguard and enforcer for illegal gambling operations. This is where Bumpy Johnson learned the business of Harlem's underworld from the inside. He was sharp, observant, patient, qualities that seem at odds with his temper, but were actually deeply integrated with it. His anger was never random. It was directed, purposeful, like a well-aimed weapon. He was not merely violent. He was strategically violent, which is a very different thing. He understood the difference between violence that created power and violence that simply created chaos. By the early 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had come to the attention of Stephanie St. Clair. She saw in him exactly what she needed, a man of ferocious capability who also possessed the intelligence to understand why restraint mattered, when restraint was possible. She took him on as her chief enforcer and bodyguard, folding him into the operational hierarchy of her numbers empire, and then Dutch Schultz came for them. The conflict between Stephanie St. Clair and Dutch Schultz was not a gentleman's disagreement. It was a war. A genuine, street-level, body-count war that lasted for years and left more than 40 people dead and several others kidnapped. Schultz had the police. He had politicians in his pocket. He had the resources of an established, organized crime empire and the willingness to use all of them. St. Clair had something different. She had Harlem, the geography, the community loyalty, the intimate knowledge of every alley and block and building in a neighborhood that Dutch Schultz's men could not move through without sticking out like the white men they were. As Bumpy Johnson's wife Mamie would write decades later in her biography of her husband, Bumpy and his crew of 9 waged a guerrilla war sorts, and picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy since there were few other white men walking around Harlem during the day. This was the brutal arithmetic of the conflict. Schultz's men in Harlem were visible. They were targets the moment they stepped into the neighborhood. Bumpy's men were invisible. They were the neighborhood. They knew where to hide. They knew which buildings had back exits, which rooftops connected, which basements led to side streets. They could disappear into Harlem, the way water disappears into earth. And yet Schultz had advantages that could not be countered purely by geography and guerrilla tactics. He had the law. In an era of profound police corruption in New York City, Schultz had effectively bought the protection of enough officers and officials to make legal prosecution of his activities impossible. When Bumpy's men struck against Schultz's operations, it was the black men who were arrested. When Schultz's men retaliated, it was the black men who were charged. Over the course of the early 1930s, more than 40 murders were attributed to this conflict. Kidnappings were used as weapons by both sides. The streets of Harlem lived under a low-grade, perpetual terror that ordinary residents, the women go to work, the children go to school, the men playing numbers on the corner, navigated with the weary pragmatism of people who have never had the luxury of simply ignoring the violence around them. St. Clair fought with every weapon she had, including the press. She ran those extraordinary advertisements in Harlem newspapers, naming police officers who had taken bribes, calling out the corruption that enabled Dutch Schultz's operation. She testified before the Seabury Commission, a reform-minded investigative body that was probing corruption in the New York City Police Department. And her testimony led directly to the dismissal of more than a dozen officers. But it was not enough. Schultz was too connected, too well protected, too willing to absorb casualties on his own side in exchange for profits. By the mid-1930s, the hard truth had become undeniable. Dutch Schultz and his mob allies had won. They controlled Harlem's numbers. Black operators paid tribute or faced violence. The empire that Stephanie St. Clair had built was, if not destroyed, then subordinated. St. Clair herself, exhausted by years of war and legal harassment, understood that the fight was no longer winnable on those terms. And then in October 1935, something happened that changed everything. Dutch Schultz was shot, not by Bumpy Johnson, not by any of St. Clair's men. Schultz was killed by his own allies in the Italian-American organized crime world. Men connected to Lucky Luciano, who had concluded that Schultz had become too erratic, too violent, too publicly brazen in ways that threatened to bring unwanted federal scrutiny down on everyone. He was shot in a chop house in Newark, New Jersey, on October 23, 1935, and died the following day. And with his death, the war that had consumed Harlem's underworld for years suddenly ended. What replaced it was not peace. It was a negotiation. And the negotiation that followed would define Harlem's criminal landscape for the next 3 decades. When Dutch Schultz died, the numbers racket he had seized from Harlem's black operators did not revert to those operators. It was inherited, along with the rest of Schultz's empire, by Charles Lucky Luciano and the crime family he led, the organization that would later be known as the Genovese crime family. Luciano was, in many ways, the opposite of Dutch Schultz. Where Schultz was erratic, violent, and impossible to predict, Luciano was methodical, businesslike, and supremely rational. He had helped create the structure of modern American organized crime, having been the primary architect behind the Commission, the governing body of New York's 5 major Italian crime families that adjudicated disputes and coordinated territories. He was not interested in drama. He was interested in money and stability. Bumpy Johnson, watching the situation with the careful intelligence he had been developing for years, recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity. He approached Luciano. He proposed an arrangement that was, in its way, audacious. Harlem would remain under Bumpy Johnson's control. The numbers racket, the gambling operations, the various criminal enterprises that kept the neighborhood's underground economy running. All of it would be managed by Bumpy and his people. In exchange, Luciano's family would receive a regular cut of the profits, a tribute, not unlike the tribute that Luciano extracted from his own Italian-American subordinates in other parts of New York. Luciano agreed. The significance of this moment was not lost on anyone in Harlem, as Bumpy's wife Mamie would write later. For the first time, a black man had stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down and going along to get along. The community realized that Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses and had negotiated a peace with honor. It was imperfect. Paying tribute to Luciano was still paying tribute. The arrangement still placed a white criminal organization above Bumpy in the hierarchy of New York's underworld. There were men in Harlem who resented this, who saw the tribute not as a negotiated peace, but as a continued subjugation dressed in different clothes. But within the context of what was possible in 1930s America, in a city where the mafia had effectively purchased law enforcement and political protection at every level, what Bumpy had accomplished was extraordinary. He had preserved black control of Black Harlem's criminal economy. He had created a structure in which he operated as the undisputed boss of his neighborhood, with the autonomy to run his operations as he chose, answerable to Luciano in a way that any regional boss answers to a superior, but not dictated to, not managed, not owned. He was, in every meaningful sense, the godfather of Harlem, and with that title came a persona that was unlike anything the New York underworld had produced before. The years between Bumpy Johnson's deal with Lucky Luciano in the mid-1930s and his first major federal arrest in 1952 represent the fullest expression of what he was, and the most complete illustration of the contradiction at the center of his life. He was, without question, a dangerous man. He had ordered violence. He had committed violence. He had built his position on violence and on the credible threat of more violence. He was arrested more than 40 times during his life, not as a man falsely accused, but as a man who had genuinely done the things he was accused of. And yet, he was also a man who gave away turkeys to Harlem's poor every Thanksgiving, who paid the rent for families on the verge of eviction, who lectured the children on his block about the importance of staying in school, who was known to approach strangers he recognized as struggling and press folded money into their hands without making production of it. He was, by multiple accounts, a reader of extraordinary range. He quoted Shakespeare. He was familiar with philosophy. He read history, particularly the history of the African diaspora, with a seriousness and a depth of engagement that surprised people who expected a gangster to be an ignorant man. He was friends with Malcolm X. The two men had met in the 1940s when Malcolm Little, as he was then known, was running small-time hustles in Harlem and moving in and out of the street life that would eventually give way to his prison conversion and emergence as one of the most important political thinkers in American history. Bumpy and Malcolm were an unlikely pair, the crime boss and the revolutionary, but their friendship was genuine and it endured through the years, including the dangerous period after Malcolm split with the Nation of Islam, when many people were afraid to be publicly associated with him. Bumpy protected him. Bumpy liked him. He was also close friends with Billie Holiday, the jazz singer whose genius was as immense as her suffering. Holiday was, like so many musicians of her era, connected to Harlem's nightlife in ways that were intimate and complicated and sometimes very dark. Bumpy moved through those same spaces. He was known in every club, every restaurant, every social gathering of note in the neighborhood. He dressed beautifully, suits tailored, shoes shined, everything precise. He carried himself with a dignity that was in itself a kind of political statement in an America that routinely tried to strip black men of exactly that quality. And underneath all of it, running through the whole complicated portrait of the man, was the heroin question, because by the late 1940s and into the 1950s, heroin had arrived in Harlem. The story of heroin in Harlem is not a story that begins with any one man's decision. It is a story of systemic forces, the aftermath of World War II, the economics of organized crime, the particular vulnerabilities of a community that had been systematically excluded from legitimate economic opportunity for generations. Heroin had been present in American cities since the early 20th century. It had been legal initially, available in pharmacies, present in patent medicines. By the 1920s it was illegal, but the illegality did little to stop its spread. It merely ensured that the profits from its distribution went to criminal enterprises rather than pharmaceutical companies. After World War II, something changed. Veterans returned from Europe and the Pacific with addictions formed in the chaos of combat and recovery. The Corsican criminal networks of Marseille, France, working in loose alliance with the American Mafia, had rebuilt and refined the so-called French Connection, a supply chain that moved heroin from laboratories in southern France to American ports, particularly New York. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the supply of cheap, relatively available heroin was expanding rapidly, and its devastation landed hardest, most catastrophically, in the poorest and most segregated urban communities in America, which meant Harlem. The statistics are staggering in retrospect. During the 1950s and 1960s, when New York City held roughly 4 to 5% of the total United States population, between 43 and 50% of all the heroin addicts listed in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Registry were New York City residents. The city was not just a market for the drug. It was, as one historian put it, the nation's heroin capital. And within the city, Harlem was the epicenter. The destruction wrought by heroin on the neighborhood that produced the Harlem Renaissance was profound and lasting. The same avenues where Duke Ellington had played and Langston Hughes had walked became streets where young men nodded against building walls with their eyes half closed, where women prostituted themselves to feed habits they had not chosen, where children learned to step over syringes and recognize the geography of addiction with the casual expertise of children who have never known anything different. Billie Holiday, the great Billie Holiday, who had once sung in the clubs where Bumpy Johnson was a familiar face, was one of those destroyed by heroin. Her addiction was used against her by federal authorities, who pursued her with a particular malice that said more about the racism of mid-century American law enforcement than about any genuine concern for public health. She died in 1959 in a hospital room under arrest. Charlie Parker, Bird, the bebop revolutionary, the most technically gifted saxophone player in jazz history, destroyed himself with heroin. He died in 1955 at 34 years old, and the doctor who examined his body estimated his age at 60. The culture that heroin consumed in Harlem was not just a cultural loss, though it was certainly that. It was a destruction of specific people, with specific faces and specific families, who had been set up to be destroyed by a combination of deliberate neglect, economic exclusion, and a poison that was being distributed through their neighborhood by criminal enterprises that stretched from the mountains of Southeast Asia to the boardrooms of the Italian-American mafia. Where did Bumpy Johnson stand in all of this? It is one of the great complications of his legacy. He was arrested in 1952 for heroin conspiracy, not as a small-time dealer, but as a significant figure in the distribution network. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He served much of that sentence at Alcatraz, where his intelligence set him apart from his fellow prisoners, and where guards noted his habit of reading philosophy and history in the quiet hours. But his wife Mamie and many others who knew him have maintained that Bumpy was genuinely conflicted about the drug trade in a way that his arrest perhaps obscured. He had been heard to say in private and occasionally in public that heroin was destroying the community he loved. He had lectured young men on his block about staying away from it. The same man who had fought to preserve black economic independence in Harlem from the violence of Dutch Schultz watched heroin tear that community apart with a kind of grief that sat alongside his complicity in a way he never entirely resolved. This is not an exoneration. His arrest was real. His role was real. The damage done by the network he was part was real, and it was catastrophic. But it is also true that Bumpy Johnson was a product of a system he had not designed, operating in a landscape shaped by forces enormously larger than himself, and that the tragedy of his involvement with heroin was one piece of a much larger American tragedy that implicated everyone from Sicilian crime bosses to corrupt federal agents to politicians who chose to criminalize addiction rather than treat it. In 1963, after serving most of his sentence, Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz and returned to Harlem. Harlem greeted him with something close to a parade. When Bumpy Johnson walked back into Harlem in 1963, he was 57 years old. He had spent 11 years in prison, the majority of them on an island in San Francisco Bay that was famous for its cold and its isolation. He had read. He had thought. He had maintained the dignity that had always been his most essential characteristic, even in a place designed to strip it away. The Harlem he returned to was not the Harlem he had left. A decade in any community is transformative. A decade in which heroin had continued its slow devastation was something more than transformative. The neighborhood had changed in ways that were visible and ways that were invisible. The jazz clubs were still there, but the Harlem Renaissance's golden glow had dimmed considerably. The poverty that had always coexisted with the culture had deepened. The civil rights movement was reaching a pitch intensity. Martin Luther King was marching. Malcolm X, Bumpy's old friend, was speaking at rallies in Harlem to audiences of thousands. Bumpy tried to step back into his old role. The streets still recognized him. The respect was still there, deep and genuine, rooted in decades of history. People greeted him with warmth that was not merely political, not merely the kind of deference paid to a man who could hurt you. It was the affection of community for a figure who had been part of its landscape for so long that his absence had been felt like the absence of a particular building on a familiar block. But the world had moved. The arrangements that had once structured Harlem's underworld had shifted. The Genovese family, which had absorbed Lucky Luciano's organization after Luciano's deportation in 1946, was still there, still extracting tribute, still exerting its shadow influence. But new figures were emerging, new hungers, new men who had grown up watching Bumpy Johnson from a distance, and who had drawn their own lessons from what they saw. One of those men was a young North Carolinian named Frank Lucas, who had been working in Bumpy's orbit before the Alcatraz years, and who had watched everything with the careful, patient attention of a man who was still waiting for his moment. Bumpy and Frank had a relationship that was more complicated than the movies would later suggest. Frank Lucas did work with and around Bumpy Johnson in those final years, learning from the man in ways both formal and informal. But Bumpy's wife Mamie has disputed the specific mythology, promoted heavily by Frank Lucas himself and amplified by the 2007 film American Gangster, that Frank was Bumpy's driver for many years, that he was present at Bumpy's death, that he was the heir Bumpy had been preparing. Their relationship was real, but it was not that simple, and Frank Lucas's tendency towards self-mythologizing has clouded the historical record considerably. What is not disputed is that in his final years, Bumpy Johnson operated under the shadow of another federal indictment for drug conspiracy. He had never fully extricated himself from the networks he had been part of before his imprisonment, and the government was building a case against him. He was never tried for it. On July 7th, 1968, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was sitting at Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. It was just before 2 in the morning. The waitress had just brought him his coffee, a chicken leg, and a plate of hominy grits, the Southern comfort food that had traveled north with him from Charleston nearly half a century before. He reached for the coffee, and then he clutched his chest. He was taken by ambulance to Harlem Hospital. He was pronounced dead, congestive heart failure. He was 62 years old. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Harlem lost something that night that it would not know how to name for a very long time. A figure who had been present in its streets for nearly 50 years, who had embodied something complicated and necessary and deeply human. The idea that dignity was possible even in the most undignified of circumstances, that intelligence and pride could be weapons as potent as any gun, that a black man could face down a white criminal empire and not break, was simply gone, and the power vacuum that his death created would be filled in ways that Bumpy Johnson himself might have recognized and might have mourned. Before we follow Frank Lucas into the next chapter of this story, we need to pause and understand the structural landscape that existed in New York's underworld, because understanding that landscape is essential to understanding why Frank Lucas did what he did and why it mattered. New York City in the 1960s was, in terms of organized crime, a city of enormous complexity. The 5 major Italian-American crime families, the Genovese, the Gambino, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Bonanno, had for decades divided the city's criminal economy among themselves through the mechanism of the Commission, the governing body that Lucky Luciano had helped create in 1931. Each family had its territories, its rackets, its relationships with law enforcement, its political connections. Harlem was not, technically speaking, Italian mafia territory. It was black territory, controlled by black operators, run by black criminal organizations, staffed by the community that lived in it. But it was not independent. Since the arrangement between Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano in the mid-1930s, Harlem's criminal economy had operated within a tributary structure that funneled percentage of its profits upward to the Genovese family. This arrangement had worked. If worked, can be applied to organized crime, because Bumpy Johnson had been, in his way, the perfect man to manage it. He was credible in both worlds. The Italian bosses respected him as a businessman, and perhaps more importantly, as a man of his word. His community revered him as someone who had negotiated their collective autonomy, rather than surrendering it. He was a translator between 2 worlds that had no natural language in common. With Bumpy gone, the translation stopped. What remained was a structural imbalance that many people in Harlem had always resented. The tribute system, the regular payments to the Genovese family, was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a symbol. It was a reminder, encoded in cash, that even the most powerful black criminal organization in New York operated at the sufferance of a white organization with political and law enforcement connections that no black operator could match. Frank Lucas understood this with absolute clarity. He had spent years watching it. He had done the arithmetic, understood where the money went and why, and he had developed a plan that, if it worked, would change everything. The plan was simple. Daring, almost unimaginably dangerous. He was going to cut out the Italians entirely, not by fighting them. That was a war no one could win, but by going directly to the source of the product, by establishing his own supply chain that bypassed every middleman, every tribute, every percentage, and brought the heroin from the place it was grown directly to the streets of Harlem. To do this, he would have to fly to the other side of the world. Frank Lucas was born on September 9, 1930, in La Grange, North Carolina. He grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, in conditions of rural poverty that he would later describe with the directness of a man who had long since stopped being embarrassed by his origins. His father died when Frank was young, leaving the family without its primary income in the depths of the Great Depression. Frank was the oldest of several siblings, which meant that the weight of that loss fell on him in ways that shaped everything that came after. He grew up in the Jim Crow South at a time when the machinery of racial terror was not merely a social reality, but a physical one. He later told an interviewer that the formative event of his childhood, the event that hardened something in him permanently, was watching the Ku Klux Klan murder a 12-year-old cousin. The murder was committed in the open, as such murders were, because the system that should have protected the boy had no interest in doing so. The lesson that Frank Lucas took from that moment was not despair. It was a rage so cold and so deep that it calcified into something almost architectural, a foundational principle that he would carry through every subsequent decade of his life. The rules of the legitimate world were not rules for him. They were rules imposed on him by a system that viewed him as subhuman, and he was under no obligation to follow them. As a teenager, Frank got into a violent altercation with an employer, a confrontation that suggested serious legal consequences. He fled north, arriving in Harlem in 1946 at the age of 15 or 16, a country boy with a thick North Carolina drawl, stepping onto streets that were louder and faster and stranger than anything he had ever experienced. He found his footing quickly. The street life of Harlem in the late 1940s was, in its way, a meritocracy, or at least a rough approximation of one, in which talent, boldness, and willingness to learn could translate into advancement in ways that the legitimate economy denied to black men entirely. Frank Lucas had all of those qualities in abundance. He worked his way up through small-time crime, gambling, numbers, petty theft, the escalating minor violence that constituted an entry-level resume in the underground economy. He came into contact with Bumpy Johnson's world during this period, working in and around the operations that Bumpy controlled, absorbing the lessons that Bumpy's example provided. And the central lesson that Frank Lucas took from watching Bumpy Johnson was not the lesson of the deal with Luciano. It was not the lesson of how to negotiate with white power. The lesson Frank Lucas took was a lesson of what Bumpy Johnson had always been unable to fully resolve: the tribute, the percentage, the arrangement that meant black operators in Harlem could run their game but could never fully own it. Bumpy had negotiated the best terms available in his era. Frank Lucas had grown up in a different era, with different possibilities on the horizon, and he had drawn a different conclusion. The conclusion was the Italians needed to go. After Bumpy Johnson's death in July 1968, Frank Lucas moved quickly. He had been waiting, watching, calculating. He knew that Bumpy's death created a temporary vacuum, a moment of uncertainty and reorganization in which the old arrangements might be renegotiated. And he knew that to take advantage of that moment, he needed not just ambition, but product. Better product. Cheaper product. Product that would give him an edge so overwhelming that the streets would have no choice but to follow him. And to get that product, he needed to get on a plane. In 1968, Frank Lucas flew to Bangkok, Thailand. This was not a casual trip. It was not a vacation. It was a business expedition of such ambition and such audacity that even the people who later told the story struggled to fully communicate what it represented. A man from rural North Carolina, with no formal education beyond what the streets had given him, flying alone to Southeast Asia to establish a direct heroin supply chain in a country he had never visited, with people he had never met, in a language he did not speak. He checked into the Dusit Thani Hotel in Bangkok, one of the city's most established luxury hotels, which tells you something about who Frank Lucas understood himself to be even at this early stage of the enterprise. Through a series of contacts and inquiries that he later described in various accounts, he made his way to a place called Jack's American Star Bar, a rest and relaxation hangout for African-American soldiers serving in the Vietnam War, which was then at its most devastating intensity. The bar was managed by a man named Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former U.S. Army Master Sergeant from Goldsboro, North Carolina, who had married one of Frank Lucas's cousins and who had already established his own connections to heroin suppliers in the region. The coincidence of Atkinson being both a Lucas family connection and already embedded in Southeast Asia's drug economy was the kind of thing that changes history. Lucas quoted as saying of Atkinson, Ike knew everyone over there, every black guy in the army, from the cooks on up. Atkinson agreed to partner with Lucas. The two men then undertook something extraordinary, a weeks-long journey through the jungles and mountains of Thailand, moving deeper into the Golden Triangle, the region where the borders of Thailand, Burma, and Laos converge, and where some of the world's most productive opium poppy fields have been growing for generations. At the end of that journey, they found Atkinson's primary supplier, a Chinese-Thai man named Luechi Rubawatt, who owned hundreds of acres of poppy fields in dense jungle terrain, and who processed the poppies into heroin in mountain caves near the border. Rubawatt sold heroin to Lucas at approximately $4,200 per kilogram. The same kilogram, purchased from a mafia's French Connection supply chain in New York, cost approximately $50,000. The mathematics of this discovery were almost incomprehensible. For every dollar Frank Lucas spent buying heroin in the Golden Triangle, the mafia was spending nearly 12. The product Lucas would receive was also purer. The French Connection heroin had been cut and recut multiple times before it reached American streets, diluting its potency. Lucas's product, coming directly from the source, was estimated at 98% pure when it shipped from Thailand. This created an opportunity that Frank Lucas grasped with both hands. He could sell heroin at half the price of his competitors and still make more profit than they did. He could sell a product twice as pure as anything else on Harlem streets under the brand name Blue Magic, and the streets would come to him because the product was simply better. The question that remained was transportation. The mechanics of how Frank Lucas transported heroin from Southeast Asia to New York City is one of the most debated aspects of his story. He himself told different versions at different times, which is either evidence of the self-mythologizing tendency that several journalists noted in him, or evidence of a man who had very good reasons for obscuring certain operational details even long after the events in question. The most dramatic version of the story, and the one popularized by the 2007 film American Gangster, holds that Lucas smuggled heroin inside the coffins of U.S. soldiers killed in Vietnam, utilizing the chaos of military's body repatriation system to move drugs alongside the remains of American servicemen. This version became known as the Cadaver Connection. Ike Atkinson, however, denied this account. His version, and the version that investigative journalist and Lucas's biographer Ron Chepaziuk eventually found more documentally supported, was that Lucas used furniture. Lucas apparently flew a North Carolina carpenter to Bangkok and had him build custom copies of U.S. military-issue furniture crates, with hollow spaces precisely engineered to conceal heroin. These crates were then shipped through official military channels from Southeast Asia to U.S. military bases on the East Coast. The truth is likely somewhere between these accounts, and may involve different methods at different times. What is documented as a result? Quantities of heroin that were unprecedented in their volume and purity were arriving in New York and being distributed through Harlem under the Blue Magic brand. Street heroin in New York at that time typically tested at 5 to 6% purity, the product of having been cut and recut multiple times as it moved through the distribution chain. Frank Lucas's Blue Magic, even after it had been cut down from its near-pure source concentration, was testing at 10 to 12% on the street. It was 2 to 3 times more powerful than anything else available, and it was sold at a fraction of the competitor's price. The effect on the streets was immediate. People sought out Blue Magic the way they had once sought out the best record in the store. It had its own reputation, its own brand loyalty. Word spread through Harlem's networks the way word spreads through any community. Through trust, through example, through the terrible testimony of experience. And Frank Lucas grew very, very rich. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas had built something that was genuinely unprecedented in the history of black organized crime in America. He had done it by applying principles that sounded on the surface like business school fundamentals, vertical integration, supply chain control, brand management, quality control, trusted personnel. The fact that he was applying these principles to one of the most destructive products in human history does not diminish the sophistication of the operation. It deepens the tragedy of it. The organization's most distinctive feature was its personnel policy. Frank Lucas trusted no one who was not family or close to family. He brought his brothers and cousins from North Carolina to New York to run his distribution network. David, Levi, Ezell, Larry, Turner, and Melvin Lucas, the Lucas brothers, occupied key positions in the hierarchy, managing neighborhoods, handling money, overseeing the street-level distribution that connected Frank's product to the end user. They became known collectively as the Country Boys, a nickname that combined the derision of New York sophisticates with a grudging respect of people who recognized that these rural men, imported to Harlem from tobacco country, were running one of the tightest and most disciplined drug operations the city had ever seen. The quality control was relentless. Women were employed to process and package the heroin, mixing it with manite and quinine to achieve the precise cut that the Blue Magic brand required. Lucas demanded consistency. Blue Magic had to be Blue Magic every time. The brand had to mean something. The money was staggering. Lucas himself claimed that at his peak, he was generating $1 million per day in revenue from 116th Street alone, a figure that federal investigators would later dispute as an exaggeration, though they agreed the operation was enormously profitable. At his arrest in 1975, federal agents seized $584,000 in cash from his Teaneck, New Jersey home. Lucas maintained that the actual cash present at the time of the raid was $11 million, and that the remainder was stolen by the arresting officers, a claim that, given what we subsequently learned about corruption in the DEA and NYPD during this period, cannot be entirely dismissed. He laundered money through a Bronx bank, exchanging drug cash for cashier's checks and money orders. He invested in real estate across multiple cities. He opened legitimate businesses, dry cleaners, gas stations that serve as additional money laundering vehicles. He maintained accounts in the Cayman Islands that investigators later estimated held over $52 million. His primary residence was a mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey, a suburban estate that represented an almost theatrical assertion of successful American life, the kind of house that the America of Frank Lucas's childhood had told him he would never be allowed to have. He drove Rolls Royces. He wore fur coats. And then he wore the wrong fur coat to the wrong event. On March 8, 1971, Madison Square Garden hosted what was billed as a fight of the century. The first meeting between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, two undefeated heavyweight champions in a bout that carried social and political weight that transcended boxing almost entirely. Ali had been stripped of his title and banned from the sport for refusing the Vietnam War draft. Frazier had become, in the culture wars of that era, the establishment's fighter, the man who represented institutional America against Ali's resistance. The fight was a proxy war for everything that was dividing the country. Ticket prices were astronomical. The audience was a cross-section of New York celebrity, wealth, and power, politicians, entertainers, athletes, and, inevitably, men whose wealth came from sources they could not easily explain. Frank Lucas attended. He wore a chinchilla fur coat and matching hat that reportedly cost between $60,000 and $125,000, depending on which source you consult. The coat was floor-length. The hat was wide-brimmed. The ensemble was, by design, impossible to ignore. A DEA agent in attendance who noticed a man in the extraordinary coat made inquiries. The inquiries identified Frank Lucas. An organization that had previously been largely invisible to federal investigators was now on the radar in a way that would, over the next 4 years, become increasingly dangerous. Frank Lucas's own later account of that night was revealing. He maintained that he had been warned against wearing the coat, that he had been told it would attract attention, that he had ignored the warning because, and this was the essence of Frank Lucas distilled to a single decision, he wanted to be seen. The man who had advised discretion, the man who had watched Bumpy Johnson move through Harlem with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to announce himself, the man who had learned from a master that the loudest one in the room is the weakest. He wore the coat anyway, because Frank Lucas was not, ultimately, immune to the gravitational pull of visibility that has claimed so many who have made themselves kings in small worlds. He wanted the world to know who he was. He wanted to sit in Madison Square Garden in a coat that cost more than most people's houses, and have people ask each other who that man was. The answer to that question would eventually cost him everything. While Frank Lucas was building his Blue Magic empire in the late 1960s and early 1970s, another figure was doing something parallel, and in some ways more structurally ambitious, on a different corner of Harlem's criminal landscape. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was born on October 15th, 1933, in Harlem itself. Not a Southern transplant like Bumpy Johnson or Frank Lucas, but native son of the neighborhood, someone who had grown up breathing its particular air and understanding its rhythms from the inside. His nickname, Nicky, would eventually be attached to a second name, Mr. Untouchable, that told you almost everything you needed to know about the reputation he spent a decade building. Barnes grew up in Harlem's poverty, dropped out of high school, fell into small crime, developed a heroin addiction in his 20s, which was, in the context of 1950s Harlem, not an unusual story. He was arrested in 1965 for heroin consumption and sent to Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Dutchess County, New York. What happened in that prison would define the next decade of Barnes's life. He met Crazy Joe Gallo, a powerful figure in the Colombo crime family, known for his volatile personality and his willingness to work across racial lines in ways that other Italian-American mobsters largely refused. Gallo saw in Barnes a sharp, ambitious young man who understood Harlem in ways that no Italian mobster could. Barnes saw in Gallo a connection to the upper levels of organized crime in New York, an education in how to build and run a criminal organization, and access to supply chains that would make him competitive in ways that independent operators could not match. They developed a relationship. When both men were released, Gallo helped Barnes establish connections to heroin supply and provided a lawyer who assisted with Barnes's legal issues. The alliance was brief. Gallo was murdered in April 1972, shot at a birthday dinner at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. But its effects persisted. Barnes continued expanding, continued learning, continued applying to Harlem's drug trade the structural lessons he had absorbed in prison. By the early 1970s, Nicky Barnes was running a heroin operation in Harlem of staggering scale. His distribution network reached from Harlem through all of New York State and extended into Pennsylvania and Canada. A DEA report from 1976 described the organizational structure with the kind of detail usually reserved for descriptions of legitimate corporations. Barnes had 7 lieutenants, each of whom controlled approximately 12 mid-level distributors, each of whom in turn supplied upward of 40 street-level dealers. The mathematics implied hundreds of employees and a daily distribution volume that could supply the habits of thousands of addicts. Barnes's net worth at the height of his career was estimated at over $50 million. He spent it with an abandon that made even Frank Lucas look conservative. He owned a fleet of luxury cars, a Bentley, a Citroen, a Maserati, a Mercedes, a yellow Volvo, and a stable of Cadillacs and Lincoln Continentals, all registered through front companies. He purchased hundreds of custom-tailored suits, Italian shoes, and jewelry valued in the millions. He was, in the vocabulary of Harlem streets, spectacular. And in 1972, Nicky Barnes did something that no black criminal organization in New York had ever done before. He created the Council. The Council, sometimes called the Council of Seven, was a 7-man governing body that Barnes formed to bring order, discipline, and coordination to Harlem's drug trade. Its founding members were Nicky Barnes, Joseph Jazz Hayden, Wallace Rice, Thomas Gaps Foreman, Ishmael Muhammad, Frank James, and Guy Fisher. They were all Harlem figures, all operating the drug trade, all men who understood that the chaos and territorial violence that characterized the city's heroin market was eating into everyone's profits and creating unnecessary risk. The model Barnes used was explicit, and he made no secret of it. He was modeling the Council on the Italian-American Mafia's commission, the same governing structure that Lucky Luciano had built in the 1930s, the same structure that had given the 5 families the organizational coherence to dominate New York's underworld for 4 decades. The Council operated with a formality that was remarkable for a criminal organization. It settled disputes among its members. It regulated heroin prices in the market, preventing the kind of destructive price wars that benefited only the consumer. It divided territories, so that council members were not competing against each other on the same corners. It coordinated responses to law enforcement pressure. It handled distribution problems and supply shortages collectively, with the group's resources marshaled to support any individual member who faced a temporary disruption. It was, in other words, a cartel, a professional, sophisticated, internally governed cartel that brought to black organized crime the kind of structural coherence that had previously been the exclusive province of the Italian-American mob. The relationship between the council and the mafia was complicated. On one hand, the council was explicitly modeled on mafia structure and maintained working relationships with Italian-American crime families for a heroin supply. On the other hand, it represented, as Bumpy Johnson's arrangement had represented 30 years earlier, an assertion of black autonomous control over black territory. Frank Lucas was not a founding member of the council and maintained an uneasy relationship with it. He and Barnes operated in overlapping territory and in some ways in direct competition. Barnes ran his heroin operation in parallel with Lucas's Blue Magic empire, and the two men's relationship oscillated between wary mutual respect and genuine antagonism. Barnes had something Lucas lacked: the organizational framework of the council, which gave him a kind of institutional durability that individual operators did not have. Lucas had something Barnes lacked: the direct Southeast Asian supply chain that gave him product advantages no one else could match. But both men were, by the mid-1970s, operating in a city that was increasingly hostile to their existence. Not because the moral landscape had shifted, not because the heroin they were selling had suddenly become more obviously destructive, but because of the convergence of two external forces that would ultimately prove impossible to resist. The first was the formation of the DEA. The second was a magazine cover. In 1973, President Richard Nixon signed the Reorganization Plan No. 2, creating the Drug Enforcement Administration. The DEA, by consolidating several existing federal drug enforcement agencies into a single, coordinated organization with greater resources, broader jurisdiction, and a specific mandate to pursue major drug traffickers at the national and international level. Nixon had been running on the politics of law and order since his 1968 presidential campaign, and the war on drugs, a phrase that would become one of the most consequential and most contested political formulations of the 20th century, was central to his domestic agenda. The creation of the DEA represented an institutional escalation of that war, a signal that the federal government intended to pursue drug trafficking organizations with tools and coordination that had not previously existed. For men like Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes, the DEA represented something qualitatively different from the local narcotics units they had been managing, corrupting, and evading for years. A federal agency with national jurisdiction and a specific mandate to take down major traffickers was harder to buy, harder to isolate, harder to contain within the corrupted microclimates of local law enforcement. This does not mean the DEA was clean. The history of the DEA in its early years is, in fact, substantially contaminated by corruption, particularly in New York, where investigators working on the Lucas case would eventually document a level law enforcement graph that was almost incomprehensible. The NYPD Special Investigations Unit, which had citywide jurisdiction over narcotics investigations, had developed what one biographer described as a cowboy-like mentality, conducting warrantless searches, building illegal phone taps, using bribery, and controlling addicted informants with confiscated heroin. Numerous SIU officers were on the take with local drug dealers. Frank Lucas was, in fact, caught at one point by the head of the SIU with multiple kilograms of heroin and cocaine in the trunk of his car, and was released. The case disappeared. This is a landscape in which his empire had flourished, not simply because of his own cleverness, though he was genuinely clever, but because a law enforcement apparatus that should have stopped him had been purchased or neutralized at multiple levels. But the DEA was harder to neutralize entirely. The Z-Team, a DEA/NYPD joint task force that included investigators Eddie Jones, Alabama Spearman, and Benny Abruzzo, built a case against Frank Lucas over more than 2 years of investigative work, penetrating his distribution network, documenting transactions, building the evidentiary record that would eventually support his prosecution. Meanwhile, Nicky Barnes had a different problem. His problem was that he had made himself too famous. In 1977, the New York Times Magazine put Nicky Barnes on its cover. The article was titled Mr. Untouchable. It was accompanied by a photograph of Barnes looking directly into the camera with an expression of such confident defiance that it was almost a provocation. The article detailed his operation, his lifestyle, his legal history, the multiple arrests that had not resulted in convictions, the expensive suits and cars, the vast wealth accumulated through heroin distribution. It was, in its way, a portrait of a man who had decided that being untouchable meant being able to absorb even this. A full-page profile in the nation's most prestigious newspaper. The article was read by President Jimmy Carter. Carter was not amused. He was reportedly infuriated. Not merely because a major drug trafficker had been celebrated in the pages of the Times, but because the article implicitly documented the failure of federal and local law enforcement to successfully prosecute a man whose criminal activities were a matter of public record. Carter put direct pressure on the United States Attorney's Office in New York to prioritize the Barnes prosecution. The result was the most concentrated federal legal assault on a single Harlem drug trafficker in history. Barnes and his counsel associates, including Guy Fisher, were arrested in March 1977 on narcotics conspiracy charges. At trial, Barnes faced a prosecution built on an extensive undercover operation that had gathered evidence of the counsel's operations, including testimony about the selling of roughly $1 million worth of heroin per month from a single Harlem garage. Barnes was tried before the country's first anonymous jury, whose names were concealed by the judge to protect them from intimidation. He was convicted on all counts. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, was 44 years old. He would spend the next 21 years in federal prison before his release. But the story of his fall was not finished with the conviction. It had a second act that was in many ways more consequential and more human than the arrest itself. While Nicky Barnes was navigating the legal siege that would ultimately topple him, Frank Lucas's empire was collapsing through a different mechanism. On January 28, 1975, federal agents executed a raid on Frank Lucas's home in Teaneck, New Jersey. The raid was a culmination of the Z-Team's 2-year investigation, the end product of painstaking surveillance, informant development, and evidence gathering. What agents found confirmed the scale of what they had suspected. $584,000 in cash, keys to Cayman Islands bank accounts, property deeds to holdings across multiple states, the documentation of an empire. Frank Lucas was arrested. He was charged with federal and state drug trafficking violations. He was, at this moment, 44 years old, the same age, by coincidence, as Nicky Barnes when Barnes was convicted 2 years later. At trial, the testimony against Lucas was comprehensive and damning. Witnesses described the purity of blue magic and its devastating effects on the Harlem community it had saturated. Prosecutor Richard Roberts delivered a statement that has since become one of the more quoted lines in the history of the Harlem drug wars, that Frank Lucas was responsible for more African-American deaths than the Ku Klux Klan. Lucas was convicted on federal and New Jersey state drug violations. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. But the sentence was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different story. The story of what happens when the walls close in on a man who has spent his life knowing where every piece is on every board. Frank Lucas began to cooperate. Cooperation, in the language of federal law enforcement, is a transactional arrangement. A defendant agrees to provide information about associates, operations, supply chains, corrupt officials, in exchange for a reduction in their sentence. The quality and comprehensiveness of the information provided determines the extent of the reduction. Frank Lucas cooperated at a level that was almost unprecedented. The information he provided led to approximately 150 cases, drug-related convictions that stretched across his own organization, his supply chain, and into law enforcement itself. He named his brothers. He named Ike Atkinson, his longtime contact in Thailand. He provided details about the NYPD officers and DEA agents who had been on his payroll, who had looked the other way, who had tipped him off to raids, who had stolen money and drugs from his operation, and allowed him to keep operating. More than 100 corrupt law enforcement officers were implicated. Some of the cases were prosecuted. Some were not. But the breadth of the corruption that Frank Lucas documented when he decided to cooperate was itself a testament to how deeply the rot had penetrated. His empire had not been possible purely through his own brilliance and discipline. It had been made possible, in significant part, by a law enforcement apparatus that was for sale. In exchange for his cooperation, Lucas's sentences were dramatically reduced. His 40-year federal sentence and 30-year state sentence were reduced to time served plus lifetime parole. He had served 5 years. In 1981, Frank Lucas was released from prison. He was 50 years old. Nicky Barnes watched from his own cell as Frank Lucas walked out. Barnes' situation was different. His counsel had begun to unravel while he was incarcerated. Associates betrayed him. Council members who had promised loyalty shifted their allegiances. And most personally, most viscerally, several members of the council began sleeping with Barnes's wives and girlfriends. They stole from him. They moved on without him. Barnes, in prison, made the decision to cooperate. His testimony was comprehensive and targeted. He provided information on his former council associates, including detailed accounts of their operations, their crimes, their methods. The information he provided led to the effective dismantlement of the council as an organization. The structure that he had built with such care and ambition, the shadow government of Harlem's drug trade, collapsed. Barnes was released in 1998. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. He was given a new identity, a new life, a new set of coordinates in the American landscape. His death from cancer on June 18, 2012 was not immediately reported under his birth name. He was in protection. The news of his death didn't fully emerge until 2019, 7 years later, when a brief obituary ran in the New York Times. Mr. Untouchable died quietly, in secret, in a place whose name no one knew. When the Kings fell, Bumpy in 1968, Frank Lucas in 1975, Nicky Barnes in 1977, the council dismantled by 1982. What replaced them was not peace. What replaced them was something worse. Because the organized crime structures that Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lucas, and Nicky Barnes had built, for all their destruction, had possessed a certain internal discipline. They had hierarchies and rules. Disputes were adjudicated through recognized channels. However brutal those channels sometimes were, Bumpy Johnson, in particular, had exercised a kind of benevolent authority over the neighborhood's criminal economy, maintaining stability, preventing arbitrary violence, occasionally turning the proceeds of crime toward genuine community benefit. What came after them had none of that. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought a new substance to the streets of Harlem and to black urban communities across America. Crack cocaine. Cheap to produce, devastatingly addictive in a way that even heroin had not been, available at price points so low that it could reach people whose poverty had previously kept them out of the drug market, arrived in New York in the early 1980s and carved a path of destruction that made the heroin epidemic look contained by comparison. The crack epidemic produced not organized crime, but disorganized crime. Dozens of competing street gangs fighting over territory block by block. Violence that was not strategic but impulsive, spraying across neighborhoods with an indifference to bystanders that even the worst operators of the heroin era had largely avoided. The body counts rose. The communities that had survived the heroin years staggered under the new assault. The federal response, mandatory minimum sentences, 3-strike laws, the extraordinary expansion of the prison system that characterized American criminal justice policy from the mid-1980s forward, fell most heavily, as such responses always have, on the black communities where the street-level consequences of the drug trade were most visible. The suppliers and financiers at the higher levels of the trade, most of them white, most of them insulated by wealth and by the structural protections that wealth purchases in the American legal system, were mostly untouched. This was not coincidence. This was policy. Harlem in the late 1980s and 1990s was in crisis. Not the slow-burning crisis of the heroin years, but an acute emergency of violence, unemployment, institutional neglect, and public health catastrophe that would require decades to even partially address. And yet, even in those years, the story was not only one of destruction. Harlem had survived before. It had survived slavery, the Great Migration's disappointments, the mob wars of the 1930s, the heroin epidemic of the 1950s and 1960s. It had produced the Harlem Renaissance out of poverty and exclusion. It had produced Bumpy Johnson and Billie Holiday and Langston Hughes and Malcolm X from the same crowded streets. It would survive the crack epidemic, too. There's a conversation that any honest accounting of the Harlem drug wars has to have, and it is a conversation about selective prosecution and the uneven distribution of consequences. The Italian-American Mafia's role in the Harlem drug trade was not incidental. It was foundational. The French Connection, the supply chain that moved heroin from Marseille laboratories to American ports, primarily controlled by Corsican criminal networks in alliance with the American mafia, was a primary source of heroin in New York for most of the 1950s and 1960s. The five families profited from this supply chain at every level. They supplied product to black operators like Bumpy Johnson, took tribute from those operators, and maintained control of the highest margin portions of the supply chain. When the French connection was disrupted in the early 1970s, partly through Operation Intercept, partly to the kinds of law enforcement attention that Frank Lucas's direct supply chain temporarily replaced, the mafia simply found new supply routes. They were adaptable. They were protected. They had the political connections and the law enforcement relationships that made prosecution difficult in ways that it was not difficult for their black counterparts. The prosecution records tell a story. Bumpy Johnson went to Alcatraz. Frank Lucas got 70 years and cooperated for a reduction to 5. Nicky Barnes got life. The council was dismantled. Meanwhile, the mafia families that had supplied, taxed, and profited from Harlem's drug trade for decades continued operating with a resilience that owed more to their political protection than to any operational superiority. It was not until the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s, enabled by new legal tools developed specifically to address organized crime, that the Italian-American mob faced consequences remotely proportionate to the scale of its crimes. This disparity is not a footnote to the story of Harlem's underworld kings. It is central to that story, because the men who were prosecuted most severely, most publicly, most completely were the men who were black, the men who supplied them, who taxed them, who in many cases protected them and enabled them. Those men operated in a different legal reality, a reality shaped by race and class, and the structural protections that American society has always extended more generously to some of its citizens than to others. This does not excuse Frank Lucas or Nicky Barnes, or even Bumpy Johnson. They made choices, all of them. Those choices destroyed thousands of lives. The heroin they distributed, the networks they maintained, the human wreckage that accumulated in the neighborhoods they operated in, all of that is real, and it is theirs, and it cannot be wished away. But the full picture requires acknowledging that they did not create the heroin epidemic in Harlem. They participated in a system that was already in place when they arrived, a system built on supply chains controlled by white criminal organizations, distributed through a law enforcement apparatus riddled with corruption, and allowed to devastate black communities because the political will to prevent that devastation was not present in halls where political will was exercised. They were kings of an underworld, but they were also inhabitants of an America that had very specific ideas about who was allowed to build wealth and through what means, and that reserved its most spectacular prosecutorial energy for those who built wealth in ways that fell outside the approved category. The story did not end with arrests and prison sentences. Stories like this one almost never end with arrests and prison sentences. They migrate. They transform. They become mythologies. Harlem's underworld kings became, in the years after their fall, foundational figures in the cultural mythology of hip-hop, the music genre that was being born in New York's black communities at precisely the same moment that the heroin era was ending and the crack era was beginning. Hip-hop was, among many other things, a music that took the street as its primary subject. It documented, analyzed, celebrated, and mourned the world that Harlem and the South Bronx and Bed-Stuy had produced, a world in which men like Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes were historical figures of enormous local significance, the equivalent of what Robin Hood was to English peasants or what Jesse James was to certain strains of American mythology. Jay-Z referenced the Harlem drug era extensively across his career, the cold, strategic intelligence of the kingpin, the enormous wealth, the inevitable fall. Nas, who grew up in the Queensbridge houses and came of age during the aftermath of the heroin and crack years, wrote about this world with a documentary precision that suggested intimate knowledge. The notorious B.I.G. from Brooklyn placed himself in the lineage of men who had built empires in New York's shadows. Rakim, Cool G-Rap, Big Pun. The geography of New York hip-hop was a geography of the neighborhoods these men had operated in. Frank Lucas himself, in his later years, became an object of cultural fascination that he did not entirely resist. The 2007 film American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington as Lucas and Russell Crowe as a detective who built the case against him, introduced his story to a generation that had not been alive when blue magic was on Harlem streets. The film was a commercial and critical success, though it took liberties with a historical record, particularly regarding the depth of Lucas's relationship with Bumpy Johnson, that some people who had known both men found offensive. Lucas himself was a complex figure in the film's reception. He promoted it publicly. He gave interviews. He received a percentage of profits. He had, in the years since his release, become something of a celebrity, doing the media rounds a way that sat uneasily alongside the late-life expressions of regret he also offered. He told a New Jersey newspaper in 2013 that he had done more damage than good, that the heroin business was the worst anyone could be in, that he was sorry, whether this regret was genuine or performed or some mixture of both, as most human feelings are, is not something anyone outside Frank Lucas could have known for certain. He died on May 30th, 2019, at the age of 88 in New Jersey. The country boy from La Grange had survived Harlem, the DEA, 2 prison sentences, and decades of life in a world that had been substantially shaped by his own decisions. He outlived Bumpy Johnson by 51 years. He outlived most of his enemies, most of his associates, and most of the people who had once bought his product. In telling the story of the rise and fall of Harlem's underworld kings, it is easy to get pulled entirely into the orbit of the named figures, the charismatic individuals whose lives were dramatic enough to sustain films and documentaries and books and, yes, long audio narrations late at night. But there were people in this story who never appeared in the newspapers or the court records or the DA files by name. People who lived in Harlem through all of it, from the numbers wars of the 1930s through the heroin epidemic of the 1950s and 1960s, and into the catastrophe of the crack years. People who went to work every morning navigating streets where the drug trade was not an abstraction, but an immediate physical reality, where the choices made by the kings directly shaped the conditions of daily life for everyone around them. There were the women who worked as numbers runners for Stephanie St. Clair, carrying betting slips through the streets with their small earnings, keeping their families housed and fed. There were the families of the jazz musicians who burned themselves out on heroin, the children left behind, the parents who buried their sons, the communities that watched their brightest lights go out. There were the addicts themselves, not abstractions, not merely data points in a DEA file, but people with names and faces and histories. People who had been born into a neighborhood where heroin was available at price points that made it accessible and into circumstances that made its anesthetic properties appealing, who became dependent on a substance that was then used by both the legal system and the criminal system to exploit them. There were the children who grew up in Harlem during the worst years, who stepped over syringes on the way to school, who watched older siblings disappear into addiction, who absorbed the landscape of devastation as normal and had to work their entire lives to reframe what normal could mean. Their story is inside the story of the kings. It is a story of who paid for all of this, not with prison time, but with something harder to quantify and harder to recover from. The community paid. The people who never made $1 million, who never flew to Bangkok, who never wore a chinchilla coat to a championship fight. They paid with the quality of their childhoods, the stability of their neighborhoods, the lives of their family members. Any honest telling of this history has to hold both things at once, the brilliance and the destruction, the charisma and the consequence, the humanity of the man at the center and the humanity of the thousands of people whose lives were shaped and sometimes ended by what those men chose to do. The kings are gone. The empire of blue magic is gone. The council has been dust for 40 years. Bumpy Johnson's grave in Woodlawn Cemetery is visited by people who know who he was, and by people who stumble across the name and are moved to look him up. Harlem is still here. It has been transformed in ways that earlier generations might not recognize. The gentrification that has reshaped so much in New York City has moved into Harlem, bringing with it the particular irony of predominantly white investment in neighborhoods whose cultural identity was built by black people who had fled white spaces in the South. Brownstones that house Harlem's poor are now selling for millions. The neighborhoods where blue magic was sold and where Bumpy Johnson handed out turkeys at Thanksgiving are now home to coffee shops and boutiques and restaurants serving cuisine at price points that would seem absurd to the people who once lived there. But Harlem's identity persists. Its history persists in its community organizations, in its churches, and its culture institutions, and its memories, and, yes, in stories like this one, Stories told in the dark, late at night, to people who want to understand where they come from and what the world looked like before they arrived. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture sits on Malcolm X Boulevard, the same boulevard where Bumpy Johnson walked, where Frank Lucas operated, where the numbers runners carried their slips and the blue magic moved through hands that were trying to survive in a city that had never made surviving easy for people who looked like them. The Schomburg hold the archives of the Harlem Renaissance, the letters and manuscripts and photographs of the men and women who built one of the most extraordinary cultural movements in American history out of poverty and exclusion, and the stubborn insistence that their humanity was worth expressing. That building and what it holds is also part of the story, because Harlem was never only its underworld. It was always also its poets and its musicians and its activists and its ordinary people who got up every morning and went to work and raised children and loved each other and built something worth knowing about. The Kings were a piece of Harlem. They were not all of it. A story like this one does not resolve neatly. It does not end with a lesson that can be extracted cleanly from the complicated human material and carried away in your pocket. But there are questions worth sitting with as you lie there in the dark, as the story settles into you the way stories do in the quiet hours. What would Harlem's criminal economy have looked like if the legitimate economy had been open to its residents? If the banks had lent? If the jobs had been available? If the education had been properly funded and the housing had been properly maintained and the political representation had been genuine and accountable? Would the numbers racket have existed in the form it did? Would the tribute to the mafia have been necessary? Would the children who grew up to be Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes have found other channels for the extraordinary intelligence and ambition they clearly possessed? We cannot know. Counterfactual history is always speculation. But the question is not merely academic, because the structural conditions that produce Harlem's criminal economy in the 20th century are not simply historical artifacts. They are living conditions, modified in form but not eliminated in substance, still shaping the options available to people in neighborhoods across America. The war on drugs, as it has been prosecuted in the decades since Nixon declared it, has primarily produced one result: the largest incarcerated population in the history of the world, with Black Americans incarcerated at rates that reflect not the distribution of criminal behavior, but the distribution of law enforcement attention. The men who sold heroin on Harlem streets went to prison for decades. The men who supplied that heroin from farms in Southeast Asia, who financed its processing and shipping, who took tribute from its distribution, their consequences were considerably softer. This is not a new observation. It has been made by activists, by scholars, by the community members who watched it happen in real time. But it bears repeating, because a story about the fall of Harlem's underworld kings that does not also account for the architecture of unequal justice that shaped those falls is not a complete story. The Kings were criminals. They made their choices. Those choices had real consequences for real people. Full stop. The system that shaped those choices, that limited the alternatives, that prosecuted the Black operators more aggressively than their white counterparts, that allowed corruption to protect criminal enterprises, and then blamed those enterprises for their own survival, that system deserves its share of the accounting too. Both things are true. They always are. We began this story at JFK Airport in 1971, watching Frank Lucas walk through a terminal with a fortune in heroin in the cargo hold behind him, calm and unhurried, moving through a world he believed he had learned to control. He was wrong about that, or rather, he had learned to control some of it. The product, the distribution, the personnel, but not the photograph of a man in a chinchilla coat, not the magazine cover, not the informant, not the anonymous jury, not the federal prosecutor with a case that 2 years of work had made airtight. And before Frank Lucas, there was Bumpy Johnson, the man who had negotiated with Lucky Luciano, who had survived Dutch Schultz and Alcatraz and more than 40 arrests, who had read Shakespeare in a federal prison cell and come home to find Harlem waiting for him, who died at 2 a.m. at a restaurant table with a chicken leg on his plate under federal indictment, leaving behind a vacuum that the next generation would rush to fill. And before Bumpy Johnson, there was Stephanie St. Clair, the woman from the Caribbean who had started everything, who had taken $10,000 and built a $250,000 annual business out of an illegal lottery because the legal economy had decided she didn't exist, who had taken out newspaper advertisements accusing the police of corruption, who had testified before the Seabury Commission, who had waged war against Dutch Schultz with a handful of men, and won the peace by losing the war and then outliving her enemy. These are stories about Harlem. They are also stories about America, the America that makes certain people poor and then criminalizes the ways they find to be less poor, that celebrates certain kinds of ambition and prosecutes others based on a race and address of the person doing the reaching, that looks at a community rich in human talent and intellectual firepower and cultural genius, and manages to channel most of that capacity into the underground rather than into the institutions where it might have flourished. They are stories about human beings, complicated, brilliant, flawed, sometimes monstrous, sometimes generous, always trying to navigate a world that the people who built it did not build for them. And they are stories worth knowing, because the men and women in them were real, because the neighborhood they moved through is real, because the forces that shape their lives are not historical curiosities, but living conditions, modified in form, present in substance, still at work in every American city where poverty and race and the criminal economy have been allowed to define the options available to a generation. Harlem produced the Harlem Renaissance. It also produced Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lucas, and Nicky Barnes. Both of those things came from the same source, a community of extraordinary human beings, placed under extraordinary pressure, responding in every way that extraordinary human beings respond under pressure, with beauty and with darkness, with genius and with violence, with the full, unedited, unresolvable complexity of lives actually lived. That is the story of Harlem's underworld kings. From the number slips carried through the 1920 streets to the chinchilla coat at Madison Square Garden. From a guerrilla war against Dutch Schultz to the Blue Magic brand to the anonymous jury that convicted Mr. Untouchable. From the heart attack at Wells Restaurant to the prison in Teaneck to the witness protection program and the death in secret and the obituary that ran 7 years late. It is a long story. It is a true story. And now, somewhere in the archives, in the memories of people who were there, in the music that took these names and made them permanent, in the brownstones and the boulevards and the cemeteries of New York, it is still being told. Wells Restaurant, the place where Bumpy Johnson drew his last breath, is still there. 7th Avenue still runs through Harlem the way it always has, carrying its traffic north and south past buildings that have changed tenants a dozen times, but still stand in the same positions they occupied when the Kings walked among them. 116th Street, the address where Frank Lucas once claimed to generate $1 million a day, is a different street now in almost every way. Different stores, different faces, different rhythms. But it is the same street on the same block, in the same neighborhood that has been remaking itself without stopping since the first black families arrived from the South more than a century ago. The Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx holds Bumpy Johnson's grave. People bring flowers. People bring photographs. People stand over the stone and think about what it means to live the way he lived and die the way he died, under indictment, at a restaurant table, in the neighborhood he had never truly left. Frank Lucas is buried in a cemetery in New Jersey. His wife Juanita, the beauty queen from Puerto Rico whom he married in the 1960s, lived to see the movie made about her husband and their life together. She saw Denzel Washington wear a costume version of the chinchilla coat at a costume recreation of the Ollie Frazier fight, and had complicated feelings about it, as any person would. Nicky Barnes is buried somewhere, under a name that most people will never know, in a place that his protection requires remain undisclosed even in death. And Harlem goes on. It always goes on. The poets are still there in the Schomburg's archives. The music is still there in the recordings and the venues and the living memories of everyone who has ever moved by it. The history is still there in the buildings and the streets and the complicated, irreducible human truth of a neighborhood that has survived more than almost any neighborhood in America has been asked to survive. The kings rose. The kings fell. Harlem remained. And that, my friends, is where we leave it. From Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, to Harlem, New York, across almost a century of history. From a bump on the back of a child's head to a chinchilla coat at Madison Square Garden. From the number slips of Stephanie St. Clair to the blue magic of Frank Lucas to the counsel of Nicky Barnes. From the deal with Lucky Luciano to the anonymous jury that convicted Mr. Untouchable. From the restaurant table where a man drew his last breath over a chicken leg to the federal prison cells where empires went to end. It has been a long night, and you have stayed with it. That means something. Before you close your eyes, drop something in the comments. Tell us which figure stayed with you. Was it Bumpy, with all his contradictions? Was it Frank Lucas, the country boy who wanted to be seen more than anything? Was it Nicky Barnes, building his shadow government and watching it fall from a prison cell? Was it Stephanie St. Clair, who started all of this with $10,000 and pure nerve in 1917? Tell us where you are watching from and what time it is. Somewhere out there is 3 a.m, and someone is lying in the dark thinking about a man from Charleston, South Carolina, who read Shakespeare at Alcatraz. That person deserves to know they are not alone in this. If this story reached something in you, if it kept you awake when you should have been asleep, if it made you think about something you hadn't thought about before, if it gave you the sense of having been let into a room where real history lives, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who would want to be here for the next one, because there are more stories like this one. There are always more stories. History is not a closed book. It is a conversation that is still ongoing in every city, in every neighborhood, in every community that has been shaped by forces larger than itself and has found a way to survive those forces anyway. The next story is already being prepared. If you want to be here when it arrives, you know what to do. Until then, rest easy. You have earned it.